Hey guys, I am going to update you on everything I see at Singapore Writers Festival this year. This is day one. I can only make it for the first weekend, so it's Friday night and I walked here. I was gonna run, but then I got lazy, so let's go into our first event. Okay, hey guys, I just got out of Myth, Machine, and Mythology with Ken Liu and Mian Yang, moderated by Charlene Shepherdson. And now I know that Ken Liu is brilliant and I need to read something that he's written. I was sitting next to a fan who recommended The Paper Menagerie, and then someone else also recommended Dandelion Dynasty to me, but everything he said was just so interesting and like really sharp. He spoke a lot about how we mythologize as humans and how that gives meaning to our societies, and how he does that in his own work. So I really enjoyed it. I'm thinking of buying a ticket to his talk tomorrow, which I was not going to go to because I only knew him as the translator of Third Body Problem, but he didn't even talk about that at all, which I thought would be a cool other talk. Maybe he's like burnt out on that topic. So those are my thoughts. Great panel with Ken Liu, and I love Charlene as a moderator. She's really good too. Hey guys, I ended up going to the festival keynote talk by Ken Liu. It was mind-blowingly good. He did like a full 45-minute lecture about art and AI, and he basically went through the history of various art forms that were replaced by machines. So the printing press, which replaced book copiers or scribes, who are actually artists in their own right, as well as engravers, who were artists that basically made engravings of paintings so that they could be reproduced, and with the advent of photography they just completely died out. And so his whole thesis was that we formerly did do interpretation through copying, and his conclusion is we don't have to be anxious about AI because there will be a role for both AI generated art as well as human created art, and there will be new types of art that only AI does. For example, like a romance novel that you prompt the AI to be exactly like what you want in a happy ending, or a general consensus machine translation of a work which can coexist alongside like all of the other different translations. So I thought the talk was amazing. It was also really interesting because he said some salty things about the role of the translator and the relationship between authors and translators, and how authors like want the translator to be good so that it does justice to their work, but also are insecure about the translation being too good because then they feel threatened. And particularly when a work in translation does really, really well, they sometimes wonder like, oh, was it because the translator did a good job, or like they feel some insecurity about that. And that's just really interesting because Ken Liu translated The Three Body Problem, and that work in translation was a huge hit. So you have to wonder like how much of this is coming from his own personal experience. But overall, he really came across as like a very humble and thoughtful person. So I'm excited to read his work. But even if I don't like his work, just listening to him speak has been really meaningful and interesting for me. So now I'm going to my third event. This is through the festival pass, whereas this was like a keynote, so I had to pay extra. It's called Poetry is Not a Luxury, and it's a panel of 3 different local poets. I'm going because I really like Pooja Nancy. She used to be the festival director for Singapore Writers Fest in the past, and I have her poetry collection, We Make Spaces Divine, which I love, and maybe she can sign it. Okay, I didn't make it into the event. As you can see from that clip, that is the line of people waiting to get in if people leave. So that's not even the line to get in. That's like if they're at full capacity, and then if anyone decides to leave, then they will let people in from that line. So I think a good rule of thumb is to get to the event at least like 15 minutes in advance. I definitely dilly-dallied and like didn't come straight here. So I'm pretty bummed because that means I've only done one thing today. I'm contemplating whether to go to an event at 3. It's about the ethics of food writing, but I might just go home instead and try to prepare for tomorrow, because tomorrow is my only chance to see RF Kuang, and given how much Singaporeans love to queue, I think if I'm gonna have any chance of getting into that, I will have to get there like an hour early. Good morning, guys. I am up early. I got an iced white and some bagels to prep for my Singapore Writers Festival agenda today. I'm gonna meet up with my friend. We are going to a panel with Hao Jingfang, who is a Chinese sci-fi writer. I actually read her short story when I was living in Beijing, but now I'm struggling to remember if I read it in Chinese or English. I feel like I probably read a translation. And then we're gonna try and queue to get into the panel with Miss RF Kuang, the hottest thing on the block these days. So wish us luck. Okay, so here's my update. I just got out of 2 events. I am darting back home for a few hours before I head back to the Writers Festival. The panel with Hao Jingfang and Ken Liu was really good. I feel that they're both like matched intellects, so they had a really good exchange. Ken also translates Jingfang's work, so I feel that they're friends and they know each other. Jingfang I thought did great in English, but my friend that I went with, who is Chinese, commented that it would be interesting to hear her speak in Mandarin because it's obviously like just not her first language. But despite that, I feel like she was able to express her points really well and get her meaning across. They discussed AI again, and it was kind of funny because Jingfang is definitely, she's also like a startup founder, she's an economist, she has like all of these different hats, but she's definitely like using AI all the time. And I think that is what it's like in China. Like the use of DeepSeek is very widespread, whereas Ken was talking more about the need for like sovereign AI, where we have like full autonomy and ownership over the data and the models, which is like a quite Western point of view. So both my friend and I like wanted to ask a question about that, and kind of, I thought it was interesting in particular that they both have had their works translated for both Mandarin speaking as well as English reading audiences, and like what that experience is like to have your works be read by a different audience from a different culture. But the panel was moderated by a local Singaporean who owns, I think, a graphic art business. She was okay. I think she did a fine job, but overall, I would say like Singapore Writers Festival really needs to work on their organizational capability. I heard that RF Kuang's book signing yesterday was a disaster and people were jumping the queue and like very upset because they were only allowed to get 1 book signed and there were no photos or videos allowed. And one thing I feel very passionately about is just like when the whole process of opening up to the audience for questions happens, I think like as a moderator or a facilitator, you have a deep responsibility to try and make that an equal and fair process. And I just, in my experience, observe that usually the questions are mostly asked by men, or men get called on the most or get called on first when there's only like a couple of questions that are taken. So I don't know, I think like something as entrenched and as reputable as the Singapore Writers Festival, it's not like that is the bare minimum. Like you should be thinking about inclusive like moderating and facilitating practices. But in general, the organization has felt a little bit amateurish. Like the volunteers don't really seem to know who the authors are or like what the books are. They definitely seem like from the street, which is fine, but I just find it a lot more fun when it feels like the people running the festival are like from the community. Okay, and then the other event that I did get into was the panel with RF Kuang and Amber Chen. Amber Chen is a Singaporean author who has written 2 YA books. They're like steam soap punk fantasy, and then obviously RF Kuang is really famous. Shout out to my friend for queuing because I was in the book signing queue. I got Hao Jingfang's latest book, and I got it signed by her and the translator Ken. But while I was doing that, Yao was queuing to get in to RF Kuang. The RF Kuang event started at 1 and she started queuing at noon. So you definitely had to be there an hour in advance, which we were. I thought the panel was fascinating because Amber is based in Singapore and talked a lot about representing, I mean, she didn't say this, but I feel that she represents the global South, and that she, by still being based here in Singapore, whereas a lot of singlet authors are based in New York or overseas, really does represent like homegrown authors, is so interesting, juxtaposed against R.F. Kuang. Rebecca is Chinese American, born in China but raised in the US, and has had like a pretty privileged upbringing, I would say. And she really, I mean, I've only read one book by her, so I don't want to act like I know what Babel or the Poppy War or Catabasis is about, but just from her bio, she seems to really embody this like Western standard of success and is kind of like a Western elite. Like, she's currently studying at Cambridge, already has a degree from Oxford, went to Yale, went to Georgetown. She has like so many degrees, and the things that she's studying at these institutions is very interesting. Like, she studied Chinese studies and Orientalism, or like East Asian studies, at Cambridge. So to me, that is a very interesting approach, because I feel like for myself, I want to like study in China or study at NUS, like the actual institutions of that region, whereas she seems very invested in still going down the path of like academia in the US and the UK. Anyway, that definitely came up on the panel, because I feel like Rebecca talked a lot about how she doesn't want to gatekeep authenticity. People that know the craft, do their research, anyone who does that should be able to write about a certain topic. You don't have to come from a certain background. But Amber kind of like pushed back and said, well, you know, it's still the case that all these opportunities, at least in the Anglophone publishing industry, still in the majority go to white people or people from a certain segment. Then another thing I feel like Amber said that kind of pushed back on potentially what like Rebecca represents is Amber was talking about how the phrase knowledge is power is a colonial tool, which I thought was really spot on, because this whole idea that you have to go to school in order to be successful is very prevalent in Singapore and in many societies. And when I was doing research on kelongs, which is a type of fishing trap, there was a lot about how these skills that the fishermen knew how to do were devalued in Singaporean society, because it's not a traditional type of schooling. Like, you're not going to school, you're like learning through apprenticeship, or you're learning through like skills being passed down. And so I agreed with her. I was like, oh yeah, this whole idea that like you need to go to school, you need to get a credential, you need to be in academia in order to be respected is like perpetuating this system. And maybe I don't know enough about Rebecca or like what she says in her works, but I think she definitely represents that, because she's like getting so many degrees from like all of these schools to learn. Like, she's going to Cambridge to learn about East Asia. I don't know, maybe she's going there to like dismantle it or to be an insider or a spy. But I just thought how the panel was put together was super interesting from that kind of meta level. The moderator was really young and really nervous. I don't think she did a great job. I feel like they need to pick people who are more seasoned, especially when it's going to be such a high profile and like very, you know, like a flagship event in the festival. When on the other hand, she was really eager and she definitely did prepare. So maybe it is good to give younger people that opportunity. But I have one more event later today, which I will update you guys on later. Okay guys, this is going to be my last update. Thanks for anyone who's watching. It is Sunday night and I just attended 2 more events, and I'm actually eating at the venue. There was only one food vendor and one drinks vendor, so I ordered the vegetarian shakshuka or shabsuka, which looks pretty good. They made an egg for me. Is this eggs? Crisp, and then, oh yeah, this looks pretty legit. And they made an egg for me here. And then there's bread to dip in it. Anyway, the event that I attended, okay, so first of all, I dragged my butt out of my comfy air-conditioned bedroom on my comfy bed with my adorable cat. I will insert some pictures, and came back out to the Singapore Writers Festival. So can I just say pat on the back for me, because that is incredible that I came out after being home. But I came for the talk on growing up mixed or others, something like that, in Singapore. And I am mixed race Asian, and I'm very interested in like racial governance and how it's treated in different societies, especially in Singapore. They have a very like heavy-handed approach to it. It was a panel of 3 people, Simone Hang, Melissa De Silva, who's Heritage Eurasian, and Ebi Shankara, who is famous. I recognized him from NDP. He is Nigerian Tamil Indian. So he grew up in Singapore, and he's always used as like the Indian representation in a lot of the Singaporean public media. So he talked about that a little bit, which was really interesting. But definitely the highlight for me in that session was hearing Melissa speak. I think she's the most thoughtful and the most impressive in terms of, just like content that I found interesting. And she talked about just the experience of growing up in a micro minority in Singapore. She did some reading from her book, Others is Not a Race, which I actually think is kind of not the best title, because this book is really about the Eurasian experience, whereas Others is like a much broader category. But I asked a question. I love asking questions, and that was like a smaller group, so it was pretty easy to get called on. And then afterward, I got it signed, so that was really enjoyable. Then I have some time to kill because I'm going to see a movie later, which is crazy. I'm like so socially overstimulated, but I had some time to kill, so I joined another panel, which was part of Youth Fringe. So the moderator is in high school. She's from an international school, so she's like the youth moderator. She was so adorable. She memorized everyone's bios. It got a little bit cringe, so I left early, but the panel was about the end of the world and like depicting apocalypse in art. And so there was one film, like TV show producer, Cyril Wong, who I actually wanted to hear from because he's a Singaporean poet, like probably the most famous Singaporean poet. And then another woman who had just graduated from uni and like mostly talked about her thesis project. So I didn't find that like super interesting, so I left to eat this delicious shakshuka. So all in all, I'm like really glad that Singapore Writers Festival is back. I feel like they have a good, smattering of international headliners. Obviously, they didn't expect Kuang to be that popular, which is really insane because she's the buzziest, most popular author especially for this demographic. I don't know what they were thinking, but I remember when I first moved to Singapore, we had Min Jin Lee, we had Roxanne Gay. A few years ago, we had Ted Chiang, who wrote Arrival, and other short stories. So there has been like a very heavyweight lineup. I also really think it's important to showcase like Singaporean authors, poets, all the other artists. But there is definitely a bit lacking in terms of the professionalism and the organization. I just have a very high expectation and a high bar for Singapore. I did go to Jaipur Literature Festival, and that I don't remember having any like issues with the crowd control or how it was organized, and it was much bigger, on a much bigger scale than this, with arguably less developed infrastructure. So the fact that they pulled off such a great festival, I think Singapore can do better. Let's do better. I don't know everything that's involved, and I'm sure there's a lot of constraints and resource constraints, but all in all, I'm really glad I came. I'm bummed to miss the second weekend, but I'm really happy that I checked things out this weekend. Thanks for following along, and I'll see you next year.